What was the most racist rule at your school? What was the most racist rule at my school? For us, it was hands down the one our principal, Mr. Harris, never stopped hammering into us. Every single morning over the announcements, he'd remind us that if we dared to speak anything other than English, we'd face immediate punishment. One morning, he claimed he'd overheard a couple of kids chatting in Spanish, and that was all it took. From then on, teachers became hallway cops. They paced the bathrooms, lingered around the parking lot, and tuned their ears for anything that didn't sound like English. Just one slip, one word, and boom. 3 days of suspension, plus a nasty mark on your permanent record. Mr. Harris loved to get up at assemblies and preach that English was the language of success. The problem was, Spanish was what we spoke at home. For me, that meant going the whole day without using the language that felt natural was exhausting, like holding my breath from first bell to last. My mom eventually stopped coming to school events after one teacher decided to correct her accent in front of the other parents, humiliating her. It got so bad that kids would actually hang up on their parents if they called during school hours, just so they wouldn't risk answering in their own language and catching a suspension. Puerto Rican kids, Vietnamese kids, Haitian kids, we were all walking around like half of ourselves, keeping our real voices bottled up in our throats. I remember one of my buddies got suspended for shouting to his grandmother in Spanish when she picked him up after school. Another guy lost his scholarship over a slip when he stubbed his toe and cursed in French. I started keeping my phone hidden and always on silent. My grandmother lived with us, and she only spoke Spanish. On top of that, her heart problems were getting worse, and since my mom worked at a warehouse about 40 minutes away where she couldn't always answer her phone, I was listed as the emergency contact. After 2 years of surviving without a single suspension, I'd gotten pretty good at swallowing Spanish words before they slipped out, even when other kids thought it was funny to try and trick me into responding in Spanish as a joke. I even figured out a few little loopholes that technically didn't break the rule. Like, if my grandmother called me during lunch, I'd answer with just a few safe words, yeah, no, while she talked in Spanish, making it sound like I was chatting with someone in English nearby. One time, she had a small fall and rang me while I was in the hallway between classes. I had to duck into a bathroom stall and respond only with yes and no, while she peppered me with questions, scared out of my mind someone might overhear me if I said even one Spanish word. To make things work, we came up with a tapping system. 3 taps meant, take your medicine. 4 taps meant, call mom instead. I still remember the day she rang me, and it took nearly 15 minutes of tapping back and forth just to confirm she was okay. I ended up late to chemistry, but at least I didn't get suspended. At the time, I thought I could keep juggling things that way until graduation. My grandmother did her best to stick to the rule. She tried only calling me for real emergencies, but sometimes she'd get confused or forget. We even arranged it so that the neighbor would text me first if something was seriously wrong. That way, I could sneak off school property before calling her back. But no matter how carefully you plan, emergencies don't exactly wait for convenience. I'll never forget the day during history class when my phone buzzed 12 times in a row inside my pocket. I glanced down under my desk and saw it was my neighbor calling. She only had this number for emergencies with my grandmother, and she'd never called more than twice before. My stomach dropped. By the time I checked, I had 20 missed calls. Then 25. The second our teacher turned to the board, I bolted into the hallway and called back. My neighbor's voice came through in frantic Spanish. My grandmother had collapsed and could barely breathe. She was trying to tell the paramedics about my grandmother's medication, but they didn't understand Spanish, and she couldn't get the name across to them. The medicine had this long, complicated name, and to make things worse, it sounded way too close to the one my grandmother was allergic to. In her panic, my neighbor kept mixing them up. I tried our tapping system, but she was sobbing so hard she couldn't follow it. I even tried texting her the name, but she couldn't hold the phone to the paramedics and read it at the same time. That was the moment I realized I couldn't play games with this rule anymore. My grandmother's life was hanging by a thread, and the only way to save her was to break the school's English-only law. So I tore down the hallway toward the exit, blurting out rapid-fire Spanish into the phone. I explained exactly where the medicine was: bathroom cabinet, 3rd shelf, tucked behind the vitamins, white bottle, not the blue one. My neighbor switched to speaker so the paramedics could hear, but they didn't know Spanish either. That left me frantically translating back and forth as I ran for my car. The medical words flew out in whatever language hit my brain first. Spanish, English, it didn't matter. I just needed them to understand her penicillin allergy and the right heart medication before it was too late. Meanwhile, my neighbor was crying and begging me to tell her whether my grandmother was going to survive. I was so focused on getting the details across that I didn't even notice Principal Harris standing at the main doors. He was holding up his phone, recording me as I shouted in the forbidden language, the one thing that might save my grandmother's life. She made it. The paramedics didn't give her the wrong medication because I'd managed to translate in time. The doctor told us later that my information had saved her, that if she'd gotten the wrong drug, she would have been gone within minutes. The next morning, I dragged myself into first period, still exhausted and shaken, only to find Principal Harris sitting at my teacher's desk with his laptop open. The entire class was silent, waiting. He swiveled the screen toward me, showing a video from the hallway. Clear as day, there I was, running with my phone glued to my ear, rattling off Spanish. "Would you like to explain this?" he asked, waving a suspension form that already had my name filled in at the top. "Why you thought you were exempt from our English-only policy?" My legs felt like they were bolted to the floor. Every set of eyes in that classroom was locked on me while he tapped his finger against that suspension form. My throat went bone dry, like I'd swallowed sand. He wasn't asking me for an explanation. He was putting on a show. The laptop screen kept looping the footage, me sprinting down the hallway in panic, phone pressed to my ear. I could barely hold my hands steady as I tried to speak. All I could think about was my grandmother, gasping for air, the paramedics waiting, and the fact that her life had depended on words I wasn't supposed to say. Mr. Harris raised his hand, cutting me off before I could get another word out. "Emergencies don't excuse breaking school policy," he said flat as stone. "You should have found another way." His tone stayed calm, professional even, but the way he looked at me, it was like I wasn't a person anymore, just another problem he needed to file away and deal with. That suspension form sat on the desk between us like a guilty verdict already handed down, like the decision had been made long before I even walked into that room. "Can I at least call my mom to explain?" I asked, my voice thin. He shook his head, slow and deliberate. "If she calls during school hours, she'll need to speak English, or she can bring an approved interpreter." I could hear the whole class shifting in their seats, the squeak of chairs on the tile, but nobody dared say a word. The silence felt heavy, like everybody was watching me drown. Even asking for help had a pile of rules tied to it. My hands trembled as I slid my phone back into my pocket. "Mr. Harris bent down, opened his desk drawer, and pulled out this thick packet of papers, yellow highlighter marks all over the margins. He slid it across the desk toward me. "Your disciplinary hearing is Thursday at 10. You're allowed to bring a parent or guardian, but the hearing will be conducted in English only." Right then the bell rang, and the room exploded with noise as kids scrambled for their bags. No one looked me in the eye on the way out. Heads stayed down, glued to their phones or the floor, like I'd suddenly become invisible. When the room cleared, Mr. Harris packed up his laptop, tucked the papers under his arm, and walked out without saying anything else. That left me standing there alone, holding the packet in my hands. I finally forced my legs to move, stepping into a hallway already filling with kids rushing to second period. Whispers swarmed around me like angry bees. Some kids pulled out their phones, clearly texting about me while sneaking glances my way. A few even made loud jokes about Spanish jail, just enough for me to hear. My face felt hot, but I kept walking, trying to look like it didn't bother me. The weight of everything pressed down on my chest until breathing felt like work. Before I could reach my next class, the office secretary came striding down the hallway and told me I needed to follow her. She marched me straight to the administrative office and pointed at a stiff plastic chair parked near the window. "You're excused from classes today, but you'll remain here until dismissal," she said. The buzzing fluorescent lights overhead made my head pound. I pulled out my phone under the desk and tried texting my neighbor to ask about my grandmother. My fingers shook so bad I kept mistyping. The thought of my grandmother sitting alone at home tied my stomach into knots. The secretary slid a form in front of me and told me to write an official statement about what happened. I stared at the blank lines, my pen hovering. It felt impossible to explain life-and-death moments in polished English sentences. Every time I wrote something, the grammar looked clumsy, the words too stiff, like they made me sound guilty of something worse than just speaking Spanish. I kept starting over, scratching out whole lines, but the secretary never offered so much as a word of help. I could feel her watching every move, her eyes glued to my pen. After about my fifth failed attempt, I asked if I could at least get a copy of the hallway recording Mr. Harris had used against me. Without even looking up, she said, "That's internal evidence. Students aren't allowed access." My stomach dropped like an elevator cable had snapped. They had proof against me that I wasn't even allowed to see. My jaw locked so tight my teeth ached. Another kid sitting across the office leaned toward me and whispered, "You know those hallway cameras record audio too, right?" I didn't. That one detail sent my mind racing. I grabbed my notebook and started jotting down times, places, trying to remember who else had been in the hall when I ran past. Maybe someone had seen my panic. Maybe someone had heard me crying. Anything that could prove this wasn't some stunt. But before I could ask more questions, that kid got called into the counselor's office. Right then my phone buzzed. A friend had texted me. People were already spreading rumors. The story out there wasn't the truth. They were saying I'd broken the rule on purpose, that it was all some political stunt. Some said I was trying to be a hero. Others said I was just desperate for attention. I felt sick to my stomach knowing how fast the truth was being twisted. My thumb hovered over the reply button, but what could I even say? No text message could undo the damage. I turned off notifications and shoved my phone deep into my backpack. The secretary kept typing away at her computer while I sat frozen with that half-empty statement form in my lap. The clock on the wall ticked so slow I thought the battery must be dead. Every few minutes, kids walked past the office window, pressing their faces to the glass to stare like I was some caged animal. Some pointed, some whispered, some laughed. My paper still sat mostly blank because there was no way to put into neat English grammar what had really happened. How could I write that my grandmother's life was worth more than their stupid rule? My phone buzzed again. This time it was my neighbor. She said my grandmother was stable, but weak, and she kept asking for me in Spanish over and over. Relief hit me so hard I grabbed the edge of the desk just to steady myself. But guilt came crashing in right behind it. I should have been there, sitting by her side, instead of trapped in this office like a criminal. She probably didn't understand why I wasn't home, and that thought made my chest hurt even worse. I shoved the form back across the desk and signed, and walked out while the secretary called after me, saying I wasn't allowed to leave. The hallways were empty during class, my footsteps echoing against the lockers. At mine, I found a note taped to the door. I had an appointment tomorrow morning with some counselor named Diego Fry. Supposedly, he worked with bilingual students in situations like this. Maybe someone in that building finally understood what we were going through, but I wasn't holding my breath. That evening, Mom and I sat at the kitchen table pushing food around our plates when an email lit up my phone with the official hearing details. 3-day suspension, permanent mark on my record, and worst of all, review of enrollment status. Those last 3 words froze me cold. They could actually kick me out of school for this. Mom read the email over my shoulder, and I felt her hand clamp down on mine. Her face went pale, like all the blood drained out of it at once. The next morning, I showed up early for my appointment with Diego Fry. He turned out to be this soft-spoken guy with glasses, the first adult at that school who didn't treat me like a problem to fix. He actually listened while I talked. Diego explained that while the school had a lot of authority, there were district policies on discrimination they might be crossing with this English-only rule. He didn't promise me any miracles, but he gave me a list of what I should document and how to present it at the hearing. Sitting in his office felt safer than anywhere I'd been inside that building in 2 years. At lunch, I slipped out to the parking lot and called the hospital. I asked if they could send me letters from the ER doctor and paramedics, something official that explained how my translation had stopped a fatal medication error. The administrator said she'd try, but it might take a few days to get everything on letterhead with the right signatures. I wrote down her name and direct phone number just in case I needed to follow up. Not long after, my phone started blowing up. Someone had posted about my situation online, and suddenly everybody had an opinion. Half the comments were the rules are rules, you knew the risk type. The other half were saying, a life matters more than some stupid policy. Watching strangers argue about me made my head spin, so I just deleted the apps. I didn't want to be anyone's debate topic or political football. After chemistry, my teacher asked me to hang back. When the room cleared, she quietly admitted she hated the policy too, but teachers could lose their jobs if they spoke out. She flipped open the student handbook and pointed to a section on the district's non-discrimination policy, which clearly contradicted the English-only rule. Her hands shook a little as she showed me where to find it online and told me to make copies. That evening, Mom got a call back from a legal aid group. A man named Ruben Guidry explained that Title VI protects language minorities, but schools usually claim safety exceptions to get around it. He warned us that filing a federal complaint could take months, long after I graduate. The system moved at a snail's pace, but my life was happening in real time. The next morning, I went to the main office and asked for a Spanish interpreter for my hearing, since Mom struggled with legal terms and formal English. The secretary brushed me off, saying interpreters were only provided for special education meetings, not discipline hearings. I wrote down her exact words. Later, Ethan Cole, the assistant principal, pulled me aside. He suggested I just accept Saturday detention instead of fighting this uphill battle. He looked worn out, like he'd seen this story play out before and knew how it usually ended for kids like me. For a second, I almost considered it. The easy road tempted me. But then I pictured my grandmother's face that night, gasping for air while the paramedic stood helpless because nobody understood her. That memory pushed me back on track. I told Ethan thanks, but no thanks, and kept walking to class. The rest of the week dragged by. Teachers gave me odd looks. and kids whispered whenever I walked past. A few of them tried speaking to me in Spanish as a joke, daring me to respond so I'd get nailed again. I kept my mouth shut, head down, just counting the hours until the hearing. My grandmother called me twice, but I let it ring through to voicemail. The risk of anyone overhearing me speak Spanish on campus was too high. Meanwhile, Mom took time off work, time we couldn't really afford, so she could help me prepare. She combed through the handbook, printed documents Diego had mentioned, and stayed up late with me, practicing what I'd say in English. It felt wrong rehearsing in English, like I was already forced to deny the very reason my grandmother was still alive. The morning of the hearing, my stomach twisted so bad I could barely get a bite of breakfast down, though Mom pushed me to eat anyway. While I was gathering my papers, my phone buzzed with an email from the scholarship committee. They announced they'd be reviewing disciplinary records before making their final decisions. My hands went ice cold. That suspension wasn't just 3 days out of school. It could erase 4 years of perfect grades and attendance. It could take college right out of my future. I shoved the phone in my pocket, trying not to spiral, and grabbed my backpack. The hearing was at 2 o'clock, but I still had to drag myself through a full school day first. At lunch, Mom texted me that my grandmother had been discharged from the hospital. She needed constant supervision now, someone checking her medications every 4 hours. I spent the entire lunch period setting up alarms on my phone and texting our neighbor to coordinate check-ins. On top of everything, I had a chemistry test the next day and hadn't studied a bit. It felt like everything was stacking on top of me at once. During study hall, an email from Ruben popped up on my laptop. He'd been digging and discovered that recording audio in the hallways might actually violate state privacy laws. But he also warned that schools usually got the benefit of the doubt in court if they claimed it was for safety. Every argument I had, the school had a counter. The system seemed designed to shield them, not protect us. Then my phone buzzed again. This time it was a classmate I barely knew. She'd sent me a shaky video clip. Principal Harris, standing by the entrance, his personal phone pointed directly at me while I made my emergency call. This wasn't just the security system catching something by accident. He'd been recording me on purpose, waiting for me to mess up. My hands shook with anger as I forwarded the video straight to Diego. That night, I stayed up late piecing together a full timeline of everything that had happened. Diego came over to help, crossing out parts where I'd written about how I felt and making me stick only to the facts, times, dates, names, exact words, who was standing where. No emotions, no opinions, just cold, solid facts that couldn't be twisted. Working on gathering everything actually steadied me some. The next day at lunch, I quietly walked the halls asking Vietnamese and Haitian kids what they'd been through with the language rule. Most of them were too nervous to say much, but a few slipped me anonymous notes. One girl lost her National Honor Society spot just because she answered her mom's call in Vietnamese. A Haitian boy told me his parents quit coming to his games out of fear they might slip and speak French in the stands. The more I listened, the more the same pattern showed up: fear, embarrassment, and lost chances. After classes, I picked up more written statements, and the picture kept getting bigger and uglier. That night, I sat at my computer typing a formal grievance to the district. I used every word Diego had taught me: discrimination, denial of interpreter services, all the legal terms that gave the complaint some teeth. My hands trembled as I attached the evidence and hit send. No going back now. In their system, I was officially the troublemaker. The next morning, Principal Harris started popping up everywhere I turned. He was waiting near my locker when I got there. He strolled through the cafeteria right when I sat down. He even lingered by the bathrooms when I needed to go. Each time I spotted him, I texted Diego the time and place, keeping a record like we'd planned. Still, the constant shadowing made it feel like the walls were closing in on me. During lunch, my phone buzzed. It was Mom. She said school seemed more worried about catching kids speaking Spanish than teaching them chemistry. She wasn't wrong. Their priorities were so twisted it could have won a medal in gymnastics. Her boss had told her flat out that if she missed another school meeting, he'd cut her hours. We needed every penny she made to cover Grandma's new prescriptions. I told her not to come anymore, but she wouldn't hear it. She said she wasn't about to let me stand alone, no matter what it cost us. Before chemistry class that day, my chest squeezed so tight I could hardly breathe. The room spun, and I had to grip my desk just to stay upright. The nurse said it was a panic attack and asked if I wanted to call someone to help calm me down. I sat there trembling, too scared to even whisper in Spanish just to soothe myself. They'd made me afraid of my own voice, the language I was born into. That evening after Mom got home, Ruben called our house and spent an hour walking us through our options. He said we should send a formal notice to the district's legal counsel, warning them about Title VI violations, basically discrimination tied to national origin. While we were on the phone, He typed up a draft and read parts out loud so we'd understand what we were signing. The legal wording made my head pound, but Mom just nodded and jotted notes on the back of an envelope. Ruben warned us that going to the media could backfire, making the school double down just to save face. Every choice felt like stepping onto a minefield. The district replied to my interpreter request the next morning. 3 paragraphs of nothing dressed up in polite language. They said they'd review the policy, but still wouldn't provide an interpreter for the hearing, which was their way of saying tough luck. I went through the email with a highlighter, marking every vague phrase that meant absolutely nothing. It was obvious they wanted people to give up out of exhaustion. That afternoon, I practiced my statement over and over, recording myself on my phone. The medical terms always slipped out in Spanish first, since that's how I learned them helping Grandma with her prescriptions. I forced myself to say cardiac medication instead of medicina cardiaca, but the words felt heavy and foreign. It was like my own mouth had turned against me, tripping me up when I needed it most. The morning of the hearing, I checked my email and found a message from the hospital. Attached was a letter from Grandma's doctor, on official letterhead, saying my translation had prevented a potentially deadly medication error. Seeing his signature at the bottom made it real. It proved I had saved her life. Holding that letter felt like strapping on armor before a fight. At lunch, I met with a classmate I trusted to go over the anonymous family statements. Parents wrote about their kids getting suspended for answering phones in their home language or missing family emergencies because they were too scared to pick up. We practiced reading the stories out loud, steady voices, blank faces. Nobody could know whose stories they were. That little circle of support made it feel like we were building something bigger than just my fight. Later, Diego called and told me to copy the district's equity officer on all the hearing materials. He said creating a broader paper trail would matter if this escalated into a lawsuit. I spent an hour scanning every document, every email, every scrap of proof. The pile kept getting thicker, page by page, evidence that this wasn't just about me. That evening, Ethan Cole showed up at my house with what he called a final offer. He laid a paper on the kitchen table, saying if I signed and promised not to talk publicly about the policy, they'd drop my suspension down to just detention. He painted it like a clean way out. No permanent mark, no more headaches, just sign and move on. For a moment, I almost grabbed the pen, so tired of fighting. But signing meant shutting up while other kids kept getting hurt. I told him no thanks. He gave me a disappointed look and slipped the paper back into his briefcase. Not long after, my phone lit up with messages from classmates. They'd heard about the hearing and wanted to plan a walkout to support me. They were willing to risk their own futures to stand beside me. But I couldn't let them do that. I kept sending messages, begging my friends not to risk getting suspended or losing their scholarships just because of me. This was my battle to fight, and I wasn't about to drag anyone else down into it. That night, my grandma sat across from me in the kitchen, not really grasping all the details of why people were so worked up, but she could tell something serious was going on. In Spanish, she told me plain and simple, tomorrow I needed to speak the truth, even if it cost me everything. She said honesty was worth more than any of their rules. I wrote her words out in English on an index card so I could read them at the hearing, her voice giving me courage even through translation. To her, family always mattered more than whatever policies the school came up with. The next morning, I found myself in the same bathroom stall where I used to tap little codes instead of speaking Spanish, the same place I'd hidden more times than I could count just to protect myself from their rules. Staring into the scratched-up mirror above the sink, I decided I was done pretending and done hiding who I was. At that hearing, I was going to stand tall and say, in English, why both languages made me whole. Why taking one away felt like ripping out half my heart. That choice gave me this strange sense of peace, like I had finally set down a heavy load I'd been carrying for years. The morning came too quick, with my alarm screaming at 6:30. I shot a text to Diego to make sure he was still on board, and he sent me back a simple thumbs-up emoji. My hands were trembling while I made coffee, and the toast I tried to choke down tasted like cardboard. A neat stack of papers I'd printed was waiting on the kitchen table, sitting beside the hospital letter and anonymous statements from other families. Mom came out of her room already dressed in her best work outfit, the same one she usually saved for parent-teacher nights. She glanced at the pile of papers, gave me a small nod, and started cooking eggs, even though neither of us really felt like eating. Diego showed up around 7:45 in a button-down shirt I'd never seen him wear before. We went over the plan one last time while Mom listened, jumping in with questions about who'd be in the room. I explained that Ethan Cole would be there as the student advocate and that the district was sending a representative too. Diego practiced saying medical terms in English just in case he needed to step in and translate something important. Right in the middle of our prep, my phone rang. It was my neighbor calling. She wanted to know whether my grandma needed to take her morning pills with food or without. I told her in clear English. The white ones went with breakfast, and the pink one was for bedtime. The words flowed out smooth and natural, probably because I wasn't worrying about someone listening in and picking apart every syllable. When I hung up, Diego pointed out how different I sounded when I wasn't terrified of breaking some rule. Mom gave my shoulder a squeeze, and we gathered up all the paperwork. I even made 2 extra sets of copies in case they tried to hang on to the originals. The walk to school felt longer than usual, with Mom right beside me and Diego following close behind. Other students stared as we passed, but I kept my eyes straight ahead. The secretary at the front desk looked surprised to see us and pointed us down the hall toward the conference room. The door was open, and inside I could see the long table already set up. Principal Harris sat at the head, laptop open, a pile of folders at his side. To his left was Ethan Cole with a yellow legal pad and pen ready to go. Across from Ethan sat a woman I didn't recognize, wearing a district badge on a lanyard. The teacher representative turned out to be my old sophomore English teacher, who gave me a tiny nod when I walked in. No interpreter was there, even though I'd specifically requested one in my grievance paperwork. Diego sat in the chair behind me, and Mom took the seat to my right. The whole room smelled like coffee and fresh copies. Principal Harris didn't even glance up from his laptop for a full minute after we sat down. When he finally looked our way, his face was blank, like we were just going over attendance numbers instead of the future of my education. He spun his laptop toward me and hit play on the security footage. On the screen, I could see myself running through the hallway while talking on my phone, my mouth moving fast as I switched between English and Spanish. The audio picked up every Spanish word I'd spoken to my neighbor and the paramedics. Harris let the video run for 3 solid minutes before he stopped it and slid a suspension form across the table, my name already typed at the top. He said the footage was proof I had deliberately broken the school's English-only policy. I kept my voice calm and admitted that yes, I had spoken Spanish in the hallway. Then I explained about my grandma's heart condition, the confusion with her medicine, and how the paramedics needed exact details to save her life. My hands were shaking under the table, but I pressed them flat against my thighs so no one could see. While I spoke, Principal Harris scribbled notes on his form. I pulled out the hospital letter and slid it across to the district rep. She picked it up and read it carefully, but Harris brushed it off, saying it didn't change the fact that I'd broken a clear rule. He insisted policies were there for a reason and that making exceptions would destroy the system. The district woman asked if she could keep the letter and started taking her own notes on a tablet. That's when I handed her the stack of anonymous statements from Vietnamese and Haitian families, each one describing how badly the rule had hurt them. I explained how some parents had to struggle through medical instructions, like when Diego practiced saying cardiac medication in English instead of the Spanish phrase medicina cardíaca. Our brains store knowledge differently, depending on the language. I asked, how could forcing someone to translate medical words they'd only ever learned in Spanish possibly help anyone? One family wrote about missing a funeral because they couldn't arrange childcare without speaking in their own language. Another told of a child who wet himself because he was too scared to ask for the bathroom in Vietnamese after forgetting the English word. The district woman's eyebrows climbed higher with every page she read, while Principal Harris's jaw just kept getting tighter. Ethan Cole finally asked if I had anything else to share, so I pulled out screenshots of state education codes that spelled out language access rights. Mom's phone rang, and she fumbled to answer it on speaker when Ethan suggested she could provide context about our family situation. Her English came out choppy as she tried to explain about working at the warehouse and my grandmother living with us. When she got stuck on a word, Diego leaned forward and whispered it to me, and I repeated it louder so everyone could hear. Mom talked about missing school events because teachers made fun of her accent and how she worried every day about me getting suspended for helping with my grandmother. Her voice cracked when she said she was proud of me for saving my grandmother, even if it meant getting in trouble. The district woman typed faster while Mom talked. Ethan Cole cleared his throat and suggested that if I withdrew my district grievance, they could reduce the suspension to just 1 day instead of 3. I shook my head and said I wanted the policy reviewed instead of any deals about punishment. I kept my tone respectful, but didn't back down when he pressed about being reasonable. Principal Harris said I was being deliberately difficult and that actions had consequences. The district woman looked between Principal Harris and Ethan Cole before saying she thought any disciplinary decision should wait until the district could review its language access policies more thoroughly. Principal Harris's face turned red as he insisted that school-level decisions didn't require district approval for standard disciplinary actions. The district woman reminded him that civil rights complaints went through different channels than regular discipline issues. They went back and forth using careful professional language while my fate hung in the air between them. After another hour of back and forth, they finally reached their decision. The district woman typed something on her laptop, while Principal Harris sat there with his arms crossed looking mad. She turned the screen toward me, showing the official ruling that I'd get 1 day of in-school suspension starting tomorrow. My record would be flagged as under review, and the district would look into their interpreter policies for emergency situations. It wasn't winning or losing, but something in between that nobody was happy about. I signed the paper without saying anything because there was nothing left to say. The next morning, I reported to the small room near the main office where they kept suspended kids. The room had 3 desks facing the wall and no windows. I sat there doing worksheets while missing my chemistry lab, where we were supposed to be doing the titration experiment that counted for 10% of our grade. My teacher had already said there were no makeup labs allowed, so my grade dropped from an A to a B just like that. During lunch, I ate alone in that room while the monitor watched me from her desk. Some kids walked by the door on their way to the cafeteria, and I saw a few nod at me through the small window, but others were whispering and pointing. One girl mouthed that I got off easy while another shook her head like I'd caused too much trouble for nothing. The social cost was becoming clear as I sat there with my sandwich getting soggy. That evening, I went straight to my grandmother's room, where she was sitting in her chair watching her Spanish soap opera. She asked me about school, but I just told her it was fine and sat next to her on the floor leaning against her chair. We watched the show together without talking about what happened at the hearing because she didn't need to know what speaking Spanish cost me at that school. She ran her fingers through my hair like she used to when I was little, and we shared that quiet comfort without needing any words at all. 3 days later, I got an email forwarded from my mom that the district had sent to all staff about starting a limited inquiry into language access practices at schools. Walking through the hallways that week felt different because conversations would stop when I passed, and some teachers seemed nervous when they saw me like they were worried I might report them for something. My English teacher, who used to joke around with me, now kept our interactions strictly professional. Being right about the policy didn't mean being welcome in the building anymore. 2 weeks after the hearing, a memo went out announcing an emergency exception for language use during medical or safety situations and requiring schools to honor interpreter requests for parent meetings. Principal Harris called an assembly to explain that the new rules only applied to documented emergencies and regular school communication still had to be in English. He stood at the podium reading from the memo in the most narrow way possible, but it was still progress, even if it was small. The scholarship committee sent me a letter saying they were deferring their decision until my final record status was clear, which left me stuck not knowing if I'd have money for college or not. I wrote them careful updates every week talking about my grades and activities without mentioning the suspension directly, but focusing on my academic performance while the review continued. Waiting for their answer became its own kind of punishment because I couldn't make any college plans without knowing if I had that scholarship. I submitted an op-ed to the school paper about what it felt like to walk around half-voiced without being able to speak your native language. I described the feeling of words getting stuck in your throat and having to translate your thoughts before speaking them without naming anyone specific or mentioning the suspension. After it got published, other kids started coming up to me quietly saying it captured exactly what they felt too. The Vietnamese kid from my math class showed me where he'd highlighted parts that matched his experience, and the Haitian girl from band said she'd sent it to her parents. Words on paper felt safer than words in hallways where someone might report you. The last week of school, I passed Principal Harris in the hall on my way to history class. We didn't acknowledge each other, but I didn't look away either, and neither did he. I kept walking to class, still careful with my words, but no longer silent about things that mattered. The fight wasn't over, but I was still standing, and sometimes that's enough to keep the small resistance going. Thanks for letting me explore all these questions with you today. It's been really interesting wondering about things together. Until next time, like the video. It helps more than you think.